AHLUWALIA. The title is indicative.
Universal Basic
So, Resurgent Indian Economy and Challenges of Universal Basic Education. So, the resurgence of education and the challenges of education. This is a very special topic. My name is Antonella Rampino. I am a journalist of La Stampa. I'd like to make some introductory comments. In Italy's public discourse, we face the question of the euro crisis.
nel 2008, nella recente crisi finanziaria che
So in the recent financial crisis, the world economy is led by two countries, China and India, because these two countries are growing at a rate of 7-9%. And they actually drive the world economy. Well, India is different from China. And the topic of education is critical also in the birth of Indian democracy. India is a parliamentary democracy. Their constitution was drafted in 1949, more or less at the same time as ours. And Indian democracy had two leaders, Gandhi, whom we all know, a much-loved leader in Italy, Pandit Nehru, who was the institutional architect of India, and Tagore, a poet. But Tagore was the moral and cultural leader of India, right because he put at the center of his work education.
E adesso ve lo leggo perché non voglio sbagliare, come dire, la citazione. Tagore, in uno dei suoi testi più significativi,
Tagore, in one of his significant texts, explained that education is freedom of thought, and that freedom of thought can be achieved only by means of freedom. And freedom has its risks and responsibilities, as is the case with life. Tagore, like Gandhi, thought about a school enabling Indians to become citizens and enabling Indian citizens to be citizens of the world. It's a very pluralistic approach, an open-minded approach, which is also integral part of the Indian culture. Now, India has developed technological skills, the famous Indian engineers, although neglecting a little the development of human sciences. And then India, based on 2008 data, well, India is a continent, not a nation, has 1.250 million citizens, 1.250 billion citizens, and 60% of them have a basic education. So 60% of Indians have gone to primary school, and 40% of Indians are poor. So these data are very impressive. And Amartya Sen, another Indian economist, has demonstrated that it is not wealth which brings about education, but it is education which brings about wealth in a country. Now, after this simple introduction, I'll read part of the curriculum of Isher Judge AHLUWALIA, who is a classical economist, and she will tell us the policies for education in India, starting from basic education. Isher AHLUWALIA has published many texts on economic growth, but she's not published in Italian yet. She is a major economist. She has been the aid of many Indian governments, helping to draft many Indian policies, and she's at the head of the Indian Council on Research of International Economic Relations. She went to the Calcutta University. She is specialized in Delhi, and she has a PhD in MIT Boston. She also had a post in U.S. universities. She collaborated with many international organizations, and she's the head of many research institutes, university institutes, planning initiatives, and so on and so forth. So she's really the gray eminence of Indian politics, so to speak. Although gray is not a color which fits her, because she's indeed a very passionate person. So I give the floor to Isher Judge AHLUWALIA.
Ho dimenticato che ha anche ricevuto. Mi scusi se la interrompo.
Sorry for interrupting you. She was also rewarded by Sonia Gandhi Padma Bhushan, if I pronounce it correctly, which is an honor, an Indian honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rampino. And friends, a very good morning. May I start with an unusual request? May I request you who are sitting on the other side to come within my eye contact? Thank you very much, because there is a language barrier. Let there at least be eye contact as I speak. I am delighted to be here, thank you, at the Festival of Economics. Last evening, I went around a little bit and saw the atmosphere, and I made a determination that I am personally going to start a campaign so that in India, we have a Festival of Economics where we get our lecturers from all the distant universities to come together at one place. We bring some friends from outside, as you have done, and just have a dialogue with those who are teaching our students on where the world is at. So I'm really happy to be here. Of course, we cannot do it in such beautiful surroundings as you do, but I am sure we will find some historic site, because that is one thing India and Italy have in common. We appreciate our history, we don't reject our history, and we don't believe that you can bring overnight changes in society. This is very important to know when before I talk to you about the subject that has been assigned to me. I have distributed some slides, but I propose to speak and draw your attention to a slide every now and then. Now, I will be speaking to you about the resurgent Indian economy and the challenges of universal basic education. You have to understand the context of resurgence, of growth, of economic dynamism in India to appreciate why and how we need to fix the base of the pyramid and strengthen our basic education system. The Indian growth story is much talked about across the world today. I believe it is much misunderstood and too often compared with China without recognizing the fundamental differences between our society and the Chinese society. India is a free society. It is a diverse society, and we function within a federal democratic framework where today you have a coalition of political parties headed by the Congress Party ruling at the center, the government of India, and a number of other political parties, including some national opposition parties like BJP and some regional parties ruling in the different states. And then we have a third tier of government, which is our urban local bodies and our rural panchayats. So you can well imagine, with elections at all these levels, we are basically a very vibrant democracy in which civil society plays a very important role. The media plays a very important role. For a long time, we had mostly the government media, but now it has been more than 20 years that we have private media. We have liberalized both in the print media and in the electronic media. So that is the environment in which the government has to function, to deliver, and to be accountable. However, what has caught the world's attention, in spite of the fact that we have been a democracy for so long, what has caught the world's attention on India in the last 20 years is the fact that now, for close to 2 decades, India has been one of the fastest growing economies in the world. So I will now turn to slide A.1 that you have. Do we also have it on the computer?
Over there.
Yeah, it would be nice if we can put that slide, because I'm going to be talking to that slide for some time. The slide which says,
You can see to the
but I don't know how to operate. Maria, do you think you can operate this to bring my slide on the, I don't know how to operate your computer. If somebody can put that slide. Yeah, this is it, this one. Yeah, yeah. Okay, here we are. This has to go. You have the? All right, it would help.
Se mi dite come si fa, lo faccio io, ma
It's here.
questa? No, per mandarli, ok.
Is there? Excellent, excellent. Okay. So now I want to make a few points as you look at that slide. You will see that the first bar shows you the period from 1950 to 1980, the first 3 decades after independence. India got its independence in 1947. For the first 3 decades, our GDP growth was 3.5% per year. This was a period of slow growth. We had an economy which was closed to foreign competition. We had a highly regulated economy. We had a heavily protected economy, as I said, from imports and foreign competition. We had an economy which was dominated by the public sector. Now, in the 1980s, for the first time, India realized that our industrial and trade policy regime was not delivering the high growth rate that the planners had wanted. So, in the 1980s, we started a process of domestic deregulation, less heavy control of the state in economic activity, although public sector remained very important, and the economy also remained closed to foreign competition. However, even with the limited and hesitant steps towards market orientation, we found that the growth rate in the 1980s increased to 5.5% per year. But 1980s was also a period of fiscal profligacy, where our government of India particularly, increased its spending much more than its revenues would allow. Some economists were warning that your growth rate is increasing, but if you continue with this fiscal profligacy, you will have a macroeconomic crisis. As it turned out, the Gulf War came in 1990 and brought with it a balance of payments crisis for the Indian economy. When you put together the increasing fiscal deficit over the decade of the 1980s with the consequences of the Gulf War, India had a balance of payments crisis so much that our foreign exchange reserves were reduced to less than $1 billion. And this forced the government to go for macroeconomic stabilization. This was also a time for a new government. A new government had just been elected. Our current Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, was brought in as the finance minister. He was a technocrat, but he was assigned the job of fixing the economy. Because he was a technocrat, because he had seen where the levers were to get the growth rate going, he seized the opportunity both to have macroeconomic stabilization and to open up the economy to more imports, more foreign direct investment, and also to press ahead with more domestic deregulation. So the idea was to unleash the animal spirits and get the private sector to generate more economic activity in the economy. Now, as it turned out, in the 1990s, the private sector was slow to respond because they were waiting and watching whether this policy will stay or it would be reversed. Now, that democratically elected government led by the Congress Party in 1991, which started economic reforms, was actually moved out in 96. A new government came in, but when the new government came, they could also feel the compulsion of moving down the reform path. So we had 3 governments between 96 and 2001, different permutations and combinations, but each of those governments followed the same path that had been laid down by the Congress Party in 1991. Actually, when the Congress Party opened up the economy and opened up the system within the economy, the main opposition party, BJP, was very angry because they said this mess has been created by the Congress Party over the previous 30 years because they were socialist in their orientation, and now they have stolen our agenda and they call themselves reformers. But the good thing for the people of India was that BJP did not go back. And then when they were thrown out and Congress came back after 3 elections, by 2001, you had BJP government for 5 years. In 2004, in a very unexpected development, Congress came back heading a coalition of political parties, and Sonia Gandhi, who is an Indian of Italian origin, led the party to that victory. And this time, the Congress was not going to make the mistakes that had been made in the earlier period. And I will tell you, that brings me to the topic of today's discussion. As I said, private sector had been waiting and watching. Private sector only started putting their money where their mouth was in 2001, 2002, after watching for 10 years that reforms were there to stay. Globalization was on their doorstep. They had either to become globally competitive or sink. And you will see that in the next slide. Can we move to the next slide? You see the trends in investment, and you see that up to, if you look from 1991 to 2000, 2001, these are fiscal years from April to March. Private investment is increasing very slowly. After 2001, 2002, private sector had organized themselves to get on board, and what you see as 8 to 9% growth of recent period is driven by the private sector. Second phenomenon, that in the 1990s, the state governments of India felt that reforms was some crazy idea of the center, and for them, life was going to go on as usual. But then they discovered at their own cost that there was no big brother. The center did not have finances to bail them out. And in the second half of the 1990s, the state governments started their own reforms, creating environment to attract private investment, pushing the development agenda, and you see this private sector-led growth in the period from 2001. There is one factor that I must point out, that during 1980s and 1990s in India, all the policy attention was focused on coming out of slow growth of the previous 3 decades. And this slow growth was the result of our own policies. We had to disentangle our policies, get out of the way a little bit, create proper regulatory frameworks so that we can generate higher growth. There was not so much discussion of education, health, social sector issues. To the extent that we talked, that we had a social agenda, it was poverty alleviation. And poverty was very narrowly defined according to an official line which showed calorie content of food. And, but before I go on further, let us go to the next slide. I want to point out to you that in slide A3, the next one, along with investment, private savings also increased during this period after 2001-2002, and public savings also improved. Now can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. No, the next one, the other way. Yeah. Now, as I said, during 1980s and 1990s, our social agenda was poverty alleviation. All the attention was focused on counting the number of poor and then seeing which kind of direct poverty alleviation program could work to remove poverty. But if you see in the numbers, in the first two periods, you see poverty is around 50%. It is only when we started moving on the growth rate front that the number of people, the percentage of people below poverty line began to decline. By 2004-05, they were down to 28%. Now, as we moved on to the growth rate of 5.5% in the 80s and 90s, and 8.5% in the last decade, we have now developed the understanding that in order to reduce poverty, you have to have sustained high growth rate. And second, that poverty, we have acquired the self-confidence to say that poverty is not just about calories. Poverty has to include elements of basic education and basic health. So very recently, in a few months ago, Government of India has come up with a new index of poverty, according to which they say that 37% of Indians are poor because they do not have basic education and basic health. It is not all about feeding people, it is about endowing them with basic human resource ingredients. And this is why, now I come back to what I said were the lessons learned by the Congress party. After independence for 30 years, we were focusing on heavy industries, grandeur of growth, trying to make distribution equal, income distribution equal, trying to remove poverty, but not addressing all aspects of social development. Then came the economic reforms. Then we were so much engaged in pulling up our growth rate that again we neglected the social sectors. When in 96 we had the first change of political party, the first reformers were sent back, BJP and some other United Front came to power. They also focused on growth rate only. But by that time, Indian people had woken up and they said, BJP had a slogan in their election saying, India shining with 8% growth. And Indian people said, shining for whom? It's not shining in my backyard, so I don't have better employment prospects, I don't have education facilities, you're not giving me better health care, why should I say India is shining? So Congress party at that time in 2004 went to the electorate saying, yes, we want growth, but we want inclusive growth. We want more and more participation by all in this growth process. And to their own surprise, they were elected to power to head a coalition government. It was at that time that Mrs. Sonia Gandhi decided that she would bring Dr. Manmohan Singh to the post of Prime Minister because economy was very important, and she will handle the political party. So she is head of the Congress party, and then we have a technocrat who is heading the government, and now that went on for 5 years. During the first 5 years of the UPA government, which is a coalition headed by the Congress party, the agenda was explicitly inclusive growth, basic education, basic health, and infrastructure development. Now let me take you to the next slide. Yes, the IT story. We cannot talk about the importance of education in India without bringing in the IT story. Where did IT come from, and how did India come on the global stage with IT? In the 1990s, to some extent even in the 1980s, while the government of India was looking to promote exports of pharmaceuticals, auto components, all the other manufacturing items, quietly in the south, in Karnataka, there was an industry coming up to cater to the IT demand of this Silicon Valley. A number of Indians had migrated to the Silicon Valley because they found that the environment in India was not good enough for business, and they used their innovative powers to help push the IT boom in the United States economy, and then they started connecting back with their roots in the state of Karnataka, in the city of Bangalore, and they will outsource work, and you had this synergy developing between the non-resident Indians and the IT industry in Karnataka. So much so that by 2001, 2002, they were actually engaging with a dialogue with the government of India, saying, do some economic reforms so the IT industry in India can flourish. And indeed, on the strength of this connection, these reforms, and one very important point, that IT needs very little infrastructure. It needs broadband, and it needs captive electricity unit. If you have those two things, you are connected to the world. Therefore, India's poor infrastructure of transport, ports, shipping, civil aviation, electricity did not affect IT because they were a satellite connected to the Western world. So if you look at this IT seizing global opportunity, First sector to respond to opportunities presented by economic reforms of the 1990s. Infrastructure was not a bottleneck for them. They were globally competitive. Today, 65% of the global market in offshore IT services and 46% in IT-enabled services is with India. IT and business process outsourcing accounts for 26% of India's exports of goods and services. Today, of course, as the infrastructure is coming up, we have other sectors in manufacturing like pharmaceuticals, again a high knowledge intensive sector, or auto components that are doing very well. Another very important factor which is not listed here, but very important for the success of IT, is the strong push for the telecom sector in India. In fact, if there is one single symbol of reform, the outcome that an average Indian can see, it is the mobile telephone and connectivity. I always tell this story that today my vegetable vendor and I both have a mobile telephone because telephone was regarded as a luxury before they opened it up to the private sector. We used to pay, we had very high charges for telephone calls. Therefore, when the government opened it to the private sector was willing to come because there was a lot of profit there, and they gave a tough time to the public sector monopoly. Why could we not do the same thing in electricity? Because electricity was regarded as a basic necessity. Therefore, you could not charge for it. The result is that neither I nor my vegetable vendor has good quality electricity even today, because prices are suppressed, and even though this sector is opened up for private entry, private investment is not interested. Finally, after a great deal of effort, government has now set up independent regulators who are setting the price of electricity, and the distribution of electricity is also privatized. So now private companies are coming in. The situation is better today. When people look at the telecom example, they are also willing to wait and pay higher prices because they know they will get better quality electricity as a result. But the next slide, the B2, yeah. This is another very important development that has taken place. IT was a separate enclave connecting with the world, but it was not doing very much within the Indian economy earlier on. In the last 4 or 5 years, a major change has been that the IT industry in India is servicing domestic demand, because Indian manufacturing, Indian financial services are feeling the pressure of global competition, and as they have to improve their bottom lines, they are using IT to improve their processes. So that has been a major change. And the nature of IT services is changing from deployment and maintenance related services to more integration and consulting related services. So this is a very, very significant development with its implications for productivity in the Indian IT sector. Now, we in India used to pride ourselves with high skills, a great number of engineers, and that, you know, we've done very well at the higher end of education. To some extent, it is true that within our system of education, we paid less attention to basic education and more to higher education. But what has now come out is that all that was good for 5 to 6% GDP growth. The moment you transited to 9 to 10% GDP growth, industry was screaming skill shortages at every level. vocational level, scientist level, R&D level, IT level, there just aren't enough people to service India's economy at 8 to 10% growth. Can we move to the... So, the focus on human resource development has emerged out of this realization that we need to do more at every level of our education sector, but particularly at the base of the pyramid, because that is what is going to give us increasing supply of higher, more educated people, more engineers, more vocational skills. And interestingly, more emphasis has been placed on inclusive growth in the past 6 years than in the preceding 60. That's the change that you see with respect to education in India. And health, education, poverty alleviation are at the center stage. Use of IT is being attempted to improve governance. Now, it's beginning to be attempted, I should say. Some states are doing extremely well, but there are many states that are still lagging behind. One thing you will find about India is that everything that is true and very nice, for that you will find something else somewhere else which is ugly and not very nice. Because we are not a centrally directed society or economy, it is with example, with demonstration effect that things happen. Things take a long time. It takes a long time to evolve a consensus. But because we are a democracy, because we are a vibrant society, because we are 1 billion argumentative Indians, there is no other way. We have to have 1 million negotiations in order to come to a decision and then move forward. The good side of it is that once we move, then that move is durable and sustainable and backed up with a democratic acceptance, you know, of that, right? So let's, I want to make one other point here about the health education in C1, you know, I'm just coming from London, where I was part of the jury to select the best sustainable bank of the year, which is serving people at the base of the pyramid. And I'm very happy to say that the institution that got this award is an institution called FINO in India, which is using IT, using biometric techniques to take transfers of remittances, transfers of government money to the poor in the rural areas through bank correspondence. And they are adding 1 million customers every month to this thing. They are a 4-year-old company, and when I looked at their record, I felt proud as an Indian, and that tells me that there is enormous scope for improving the governance of public delivery of goods. Maybe in the years that in the years to come, we will have more and more subsidy to the poor in the form of cash transfers, and through IT, if cash can be delivered to their hands, that is better than it's leaking through the system when they get food subsidy or fertilizer subsidy or other things. Yes. Now, why is education so important? Because We are a very young society, and we are at a sweet spot in our demographic transition. Whereas countries like China will be seeing a decline in their percentage of working age population beyond the period that you see here, 2030, India will still be seeing an increase in the youth in the age group from 15 to 64 in its working population. We normally describe this as demographic dividend. But the truth is that if we don't get our educational system right, if we don't get our health system right, this demographic dividend could become a demographic disaster. And hence the importance of education. So we go to C3, the next slide. The government is at you look at the lower bullet, at one end they are setting up a whole range of new universities, new centers of excellence, new institutes of technology, new institutes of management to cater to the growing needs of industry and services of the economy. On the other hand, they are also going in for expanding the infrastructure for vocational skills. The National Skill Development Initiative is explicitly directed at promoting vocational skills. Can we go? Now, as you can see, India today spends much less as percent of GDP on education than other comparable developing countries. Our ambition is to raise this to 6% within the next 5 years, but spending alone is not enough. Systems of delivery have to be improved so that this spending is actually effective. Now, at the very base of the pyramid, commitment to universal primary education at long last. This should have happened in 1950, but in 1950, our constitution only gave us a directive principle that each child should be educated. It was not a fundamental right. Now, what the constitution has done is it has made this right to education, right to basic education, a fundamental right of every child. So if in any part of India a child is not in school, the parents are accountable, the state is accountable. The Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan is a campaign for universal primary education, which was started in 2000 by the Government of India. And the Right to Education Act in 2009 has formalized it, that this is a commitment, this is an obligation of the state, that this should be so. Just to give you an idea of where we are in terms of literacy rate, today, very low. And can we go to the next slide? The adult literacy rate, again, is 66% in India compared to the other countries' adult literacy, which is much, much higher. We have to fix that. So now I turn to what are the challenges that we face in delivering this basic education. First of all, under our constitution, education and health are on the concurrent list, which means the Government of India and the state government have a joint responsibility for delivering education. But the constitution also says that the responsibility for implementing this is totally with the state government. So that is the context in which we have to deliver education. Now, we need to devolve power to the second and third tier of government, but Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan is a centrally sponsored scheme from the government of India which gives money to the state governments and says, you have to spend this money in doing X, Y, Z to improve education in your state government. Also, the states have to put 20 to 30% of the money. So if the state government does not have money, it cannot use the center's money. And the problems with the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan are that it is focusing too much on physical infrastructure. Do you have boundary walls in your school? Do you have separate toilet for girls? Do you have women teachers where there are girls? But it is not focusing on outcomes. And because it is not focusing on outcomes, it is bypassing why it is that even when you have good infrastructure, you are not getting good outcomes. That has to do with the system of delivery, which I will come to. But this last point there is the previous slide, please. The inadequate focus, D4, please. Inadequate focus on teachers' training, teaching equipment, research, evaluation, monitoring, supervision. All of this only gets less than 10% of the funds of SSA. And I think this has to change because as I will show you, the problem is in this area and not only in the area of physical infrastructure. For the last 5 years, I have been studying the economy of Punjab, one of the richest states of the Indian economy, and I have been looking at their primary education system. And what I find is that Punjab is among the top 3 in terms of physical infrastructure index for primary schools. But when it comes to outcomes, it is way at the bottom, as you will see from this chart, D5, you have Punjab somewhere down the line where it shows you that 35.7% of class 5 students cannot read a level 2 text. Now this was a survey that was done by ASAR, a very highly respected NGO called Pratham, had done this across the different states, and this highlights the point that I'm making, that physical infrastructure is not enough. If we go to the next slide, you find after the NGO did the survey, an official body of the government of India did the same survey. And the same results come out, which really show that both in language and in mathematics, the percentage marks attained are very, very low. We come to the explanations for poor learning outcomes. One study by a group of academics based at Harvard, led by Professor Kremer, had done inter-country survey of teacher absenteeism in primary schools. And they found that in India, 25% of teachers were absent during unannounced visits to government schools. And another survey in India had also shown that the absenteeism was much higher than in other countries. So what are the factors behind teacher absenteeism? Teachers are hired at the state level, and the states of India are almost as large as a typical European country. So you have this cadre of teachers at the state level posted in distant corners. Then you have strong trade unions enforcing job security, high political influence in appointments, promotions, and transfers. So if I am a teacher, I have no interest in being posted in Gurdaspur, which is the remote district of Punjab, but the vacancy happens to be only in Gurdaspur. I will use my political clout to be appointed to the school in Gurdaspur, and then I will use my clout to be transferred to teach in Ludhiana or Patiala, which are the central places. As a result, when you visit typically these remote villages and towns, you find either there are no teachers or there are teachers who subcontract their job, because government jobs pay 10 times as much as what teachers are paid in private schools. So if the government is going to pay me 15,000 rupees, I get the job, I hire some junior person to teach for 5,000 rupees, I pocket 10,000 rupees and live happily in the center of the state. So, and there is no system, virtually no system of supervision, and there are no regulatory institutions and standards. With that kind of system, spending money only on physical infrastructure is not going to deliver outcomes. You have to fix your delivery mechanisms. Now, some people say, why don't you let market function? Now, in the state of Punjab, which is a rich state, indeed the state government allowed the market to function. So you have, even in the villages, you have private schools. Because people have money, they want to pay. Today there is this realization that my child can also be an IT innovator, so I want my child to go to school, learn computers. Even in the rural areas of Punjab, people are willing to pay. They want their children to learn English, so they send them to private schools. And these private schools are unrecognized. The reason they don't want to recognize is because then the government inspectors will only want more money. They will create problems for them to function. So they take teachers with higher academic qualification. What you see here is based on a survey done by an NGO. Higher academic qualification, they are paid much less than government teachers. There are less students per teacher in a private school than in a government school. There are more female teachers encouraging parents to send girl child to school. And as I said, there are more English medium schools. However, this market response cannot take care of the underlying problems. But before I come to that, let me just point out the major features of the Right to Education Act. Every child from age 6 to 14 shall have right to free and compulsory elementary education. And some of these other things, you know, which are there. But let us move to the next slide. What are the problems with, can I go to the next slide? Again, the right to education focuses more on inputs than on outcomes, and it wants all schools, all private schools to get recognized. That will only create more corruption, and also it does not address how to reform the government schools. So, what are the challenges in universalizing basic education? Physical infrastructure takes you only so far. Private sector also takes you halfway. Public-private partnership is a possible way forward, but you need special focus on the poor and therefore on reform of government schools. Main point is the institutions for delivery of education have to improve. Governance reform is crucial. We need to introduce innovation in the use of IT, in the use of digital equalizer in schools. Now, what I find is that aspirations in a fast-growing economy, aspirations in a democracy are rising, and IT performance further raises people's ambition. There is strong demand for education at every level. Civil society and NGOs are highlighting the flaws in the system. They have generated an environment in which the state has to respond, irrespective of which party, political party they represent. Today, people are demanding better basic education, better basic health, better vocational skills, and with growing urbanization. India is very under-urbanized today, but if we are going to have 8 to 10% growth in the years to come, and I would like to take you back to slide 1. I want to show you something in the very first slide, A.1. Now that's where I would like to end. You see, the right-hand side gives you the growth in recent years. Last 10 years, Indian economy grew at 7.2% per year. Last 7 years, 7.8% per year. 5 years prior to the meltdown, 8.9% per year. And even after the meltdown, global financial crisis, in the last 2 years, the growth has been on average 7%. And this growth of the past 2 years, this resilience of the Indian economy is based on the fact that Indian economy is even today to a much larger extent driven by domestic demand rather than exports. So when external markets were collapsing, domestic demand was giving the resilience to the Indian economy, and our financial sector is relatively insulated so that we did not get as much shocks from the global crisis as many other economies did. So in this kind of atmosphere where the economy is booming, the democracy is flourishing, the civil society is on the job, pointing out all the flaws of the system. All these things are working together to make India move forward. Now, India will never look as good as it is because we hang our dirty linen for all to see. Whereas I think those who compare us with China do not realize that China is a closed society with an open mind. We are an open society which is now opening its mind and its doors to foreign investment, foreign goods, foreign ideas, and there is no doubt in my mind that with that as our basic bottom line, that we will really see not only poverty abolished from India within a foreseeable future, but that prosperity to be delivered to the people of India. Thank you. Yes, yes.
Ringraziamo naturalmente.
Thank you very much to Professor Judge AHLUWALIA for her report that certainly has been very interesting. I'd like to throw the floor open. Do you have questions now? Nobody apparently is raising their hands. Well, apparently, ladies first and then young students are going to be given a mic. Please wait for the mic before voicing your question. Can you hear the translation all right? Can you hear? Okay, thanks. school programs or curricula are certainly influenced by the parties, and I know that BJP in 2001 has been introduced the revision of history books. Now, has something been changed upon that? I'd like to add something, Professor AHLUWALIA, but we have very much the same controversy on handbooks, where here in Italy, because we've seen that changes have been contributed to the handbooks of history, so much so that now the story can be actually seen differently. Indeed, that the lady was referring also to changes that have been contributed by the right-wing government, and I know that the same thing politically happened in India.
Certo. Prego.
In your slides, you said that there are new universities opening up in India. As far as I know, Indian students would go to London universities or to US universities mainly. So do you think that the opening up of these new state universities is going to be part of a general project for the development of India? But do you think that this is also a way to get away basically from this dependency on the UK? And what is the influence that the colonization from the UK had on India? More questions from the floor? I'd like to ask a question myself, but actually no. First, somebody from the audience. To what extent do you think it is important to know the Hindi language? I understand that the markets basically use English, but I understand that there's also a national language that has important repercussions, because this brings with it the whole heritage of the country. More questions again, a gentleman. Well, 3 questions here. How much is the salary of teachers if compared to other professions or to other? So are they paid less than? And how much children do have to pay for private schools, and what is the trade union's stance on the reform? No more questions, so I'd like to voice my own question, if I may. Professor AHLUWALIA. The devolution of power to states from the central government, has it worsened the situation? Because you know that in Italy, there's some degree of empowerment to regional authorities. Obviously, regions are much smaller than your states, but regions have some power also in terms of governing schools. I think that there are no questions, so I believe that you can take your questions now and answer them, if you may.
First of all, thank you very much for the very good quality of questions. I was told that the audience is shy and they may not ask questions. I always judge my effectiveness by the questions that I arouse. So you have really lived up to my expectations. I didn't think you would be shy after all the things that I tell you. You would want to question me and challenge me on some things. But so thank you very much. Let me go in the back order. The devolution of power to the states, has it worsened the situation? Actually, we have never really had non-devolution of power to the states. What was happening before the economic reforms was that because the center tried to do central planning and it would put its resources in the states, somehow the states, would listen to what the center was saying and also became very laid back. Now, after the reforms, the states have actually realized that they have to attract investment, they have to do development, and because it is not the same party which is ruling at the center and the states, there are a number of regional parties. The states are actually democratically very active. So I don't think I would say that situation has worsened. It has led to more regional inequality. So in that sense, the more progressive states have been able to achieve more. The laggard states are left behind. But if you call that a deterioration, to some extent, yes. But on the other hand, in the earlier regime, everybody was held back to the lowest common denominator. Now, where we are having a problem with devolution is in devolving to the urban local bodies. Because currently, I'm heading a committee on urban infrastructure to advise the government on what to do. And what I find is that there is lack of capacity at the urban local bodies level, and yet there is need for devolution because the needs of the urban poor, the needs of the urban citizen for basic water and sanitation will not be really dealt with from the center, from the state government. The state governments are not willing to put that kind of resources. So now the center has found a way of even bypassing the state governments, and they have started something called the National Urban Renewal Scheme, in which they are giving money directly to urban local bodies, providing they put their house in order. So this devolution thing, at one level, we cannot get away from it because our constitution mandates that we have democratic elections at all levels. It does create some problems at some levels, but not at the level of the state government. Now, how much is the salary of teachers compared to others? Salary of government teachers is linked to the salaries of the government structures. For a long time, we had government servants being paid much less than the private sector. But in the last 8 to 10 years, the government salaries have increased through a couple of pay commission awards. And as a result, the government school teachers, as I mentioned to you earlier, are earning about 7 to 10 times what you would pay a private school teacher for the primary teacher. In a think tank where I am the board chair, we are having serious problem retaining our researchers because university pays are now much above what we could pay, and they are teaching for 9 months of the year in the university. So we are feeling the pinch to match the salaries of university teachers today. Trade unions are very active, very organized, although a little dormant, because there is a lot of criticism about outcomes. This data that has been created by the surveys have put the teachers' union on the defensive a little bit. And in some of the leftist government states, they are still more in control, but in some other states, they are more on the defensive. And since the market is one, even the left governments realize that unless they put their trade unions in check, they will lose out. I think that when you have a growing economy with growing employment opportunities, trade unions cannot bully you as much as they can when you have a slow-growing economy. I think that is the transition that we are going through. Is it important to know Hindi because markets use English? You know, as you must know, today there is wide consensus that a child, if he or she can be taught 3 or 4 languages, the child is richer in the years to come than just being taught one language. I am a Punjabi who grew up and studied in Bengal in a Hindi medium school where English was a second language. So I grew up with Hindi, English, and Bengali in my school, and Punjabi taught at home because my parents thought I should be able to read the scriptures. And I find having the knowledge of these 4 languages, especially in a country like India, which has so many languages, there is at least half of India that I can cover where I can talk to people in every village. And when I go to Bangladesh, I talk to people in Bengali. I met the central bank governor of Bangladesh in London, and we were talking in Bengali. When I go to Pakistan, I speak in Punjabi. I believe that, and our system actually says national language for a few years in school, English medium, if you have English medium, otherwise English as a second language. That everybody does because the market wants that. A regional language. So typically, kids are learning these 3 languages, and I think that that is really very, very wise, and I support that. Now, central universities are coming up in India, and Indian students earlier on could go out. Does this mean we can now get away from our dependency on UK and the US? You know, while universities are coming up, and we also have many universities, the truth is that our universities are not world class, and because we are a free society, and to the extent that the elite and those who, you know, do very brilliantly and through a competitive process get into Harvard or London School or Oxford or Cambridge, I don't think that our system would put brakes on them not getting there. But one very interesting thing has happened. One is that many of these people who go abroad to study, the young kids today, are coming back to work in India. And they are not coming back out of any great patriotic zeal, but they are coming back because they say, they believe that India is the happening place today. And they want to be part of this change. I mean, I went to MIT to get my PhD in economics, worked for 5-6 years in the US, and then came back in 1979. And that was very unusual in those days. Whoever went and had an American degree settled there. And I was very happy to come back, and I've had very good professional experience. My children went to Harvard and Oxford, both boys. After their studies, they've both come back, and they're working, and not working in the government, they're working in the private sector. And a lot of their friends are doing the same thing. Because what is more, a lot of non-Indians are coming back to work in India because they find that, you know, there's too much change happening, and the youth always likes to be part of change, part of innovation, part of challenges. I'm not making it sound as if everything is right. No, far from it. But precisely because of that, it's fun to be there because you can fix things. Now, the history, the vision of history in our textbooks, and the BJP government tried to change some of that. Yes, that is very true. Now, because education is a state subject, in some of the state governments where they have put these new textbooks and where they are still in power, it is not possible for others to go and remove those textbooks. But what you do is you can challenge them through the private sector schools, through the rest of India, through sometimes public interest litigation in the courts, that such and such textbook is inciting communal feelings which is against the Constitution. And all of these things are happening, but that does not mean that all such books are out. So this is, again, our system puts in a lot of checks and balances. But we have to live with some of this mess as we struggle through the system. Yeah? Thank you.
Bene, ringraziamo moltissimo.
Well, I believe that we cannot but thank most warmly Professor AHLUWALIA for her very interesting lecture, for her very interesting and suggestive answers. And I think that we can call it a day and close our meeting so as to enable the attendants to follow the other lectures that are going to start in the next half hour. So I'd like to thank you all. I'd like to thank Professor AHLUWALIA again. Thank you.